On the 25th of November 1835, in the city of Dunfermline, Scotland, a little boy was born named Andrew Carnegie. Carnegie is known as one of the men who built America, next to people like Henry Ford or Cornelius Vanderbilt. Carnegie's parents were extremely poor. His parents worked in a textile factory and they could barely get by. When the Industrial Revolution happened, instead of helping Carnegie's dad out, it actually damaged him and his wages got even lower. It got to a point where in the year 1848, Andrew Carnegie's father took the entire family and bought tickets to go to America, with only 20 pounds in his pocket. When he was researching America, he realized that Pittsburgh is a good city to start their brand new lives. They can get a job and even a place to stay. Once they got to America, they realized it's not as easy as it sounds, because you still have to work very hard to get what you want. Carnegie's father was still struggling to come up with money, and eventually, after struggling for many months, Andrew decides to quit school to get a job to help out the family. Andrew gets a job in a telegraph office, and he would deliver messages on his bicycle. It got to a point where Andrew mastered the art of telegraph. He would remember the Morse code and not even write it down. That's how good he was. One of the businessmen in Pittsburgh at that time was Thomas Scott, and he realized that this kid is a little too bright, so he decided to hire him for $35 a month, which was much higher than what he was making in the telegraph office. When we get to the year 1861 and the Civil War begins, the Union calls for Andrew Carnegie to come and serve in the army. But Andrew Carnegie had saved up some money and he paid $850 for someone else to go for him. $850 at this time is insane. It's like $27,000. And since Carnegie had just started his work and didn't want to start all over in a few years, he decided to invest that money so he can continue working. When the war began, most of the bridges around the US were built with wood. And that means the enemy can easily burn them down so the troops cannot go by. Andrew started to think on how to fix this problem. He realized that he could just rebuild the same design of a bridge with iron. This is when he started to make some real money. He started working and he even creates a company called Keystone Bridge Company. He makes so much money through the Civil War that he even buys his own smelting factory. Now, the iron he's using for the bridges is being manufactured by him, so he's making a whole lot more money than ever before. Carnegie's factory started to grow where he wasn't only manufacturing metal for bridges, he was making metal for train tracks, structures, and many other things. Many years before this is happening, meaning in the year 1856, a man by the name of Henry Bessemer had already invented something that would make manufacturing steel a whole lot easier. Steel had already been invented, but it was extremely difficult to make it without costing a whole lot. But Henry Bessemer's design cut the cost down. Andrew Carnegie was one of the very first people that actually executed Bessemer's idea and executed his idea in his factory. So in a way, you could say Andrew Carnegie built one of the first steel mills in the world. After building the steel mill, he decided to move his factory and headquarters to New York City. It's interesting because Andrew Carnegie hated the people from New York City, and he thought they were con artists and they're untrustworthy. But anyways, he moved there because it was better for his business, and it truly was. Carnegie was pretty much the first successful steel mill, and it was the reason that a city like New York could be built like this. If there were no steel, you couldn't have a building like this. Another innovative thing Andrew Carnegie did, he would hire the best engineers and architects to come inside his factory to take a look on how we can make the design better so the assembly could work better. That means the factory could produce more in a shorter period of time and cost less. In a way, he was thinking about an assembly line, but for a steel mill. Henry Ford did this for vehicles, but at this time, Henry Ford isn't even born yet. Andrew Carnegie was extremely ruthless towards his employees. He would say, "We don't have time to have time off. We have to work 364 days a year, and you have to work 10-hour shifts." The only day they get off is the 4th of July, Independence Day. They wouldn't even get Thanksgiving or Christmas or even New Year's off. Andrew Carnegie has even said that he wishes his employees were like his machines, because machines do not need sleep. Carnegie was extremely wealthy at this time, and the newspapers had his back. They would say good about him. They would say he takes care of his workers, and he helps poor people out. Even though Andrew Carnegie didn't really go to school, but he had a lot of knowledge, especially in the steel world. But the customers that would buy his steel weren't very educated. So one of his sales pitch was to throw in big words in the sales pitch where the customer is too embarrassed to ask what that word means. Like, he would use some huge word on how his steel is better than the competition, and just by embarrassment, the customer would buy from him. Carnegie's steel was better, but this tactic worked beautifully against the customer. All the structures that would go up, the bridges, the railroad tracks, all needed Carnegie steel, and the biggest customer was the railroad. If you've seen our video about Cornelius Vanderbilt, you know that he was extremely ruthless in a way where he would lower his prices until the day his competitors would run out of money and they were forced to sell their company to Vanderbilt himself. But in the steel world, Carnegie was doing the same thing. He would beat the competition so badly that they would go bankrupt, and they were forced to sell their company to Andrew Carnegie for very cheap. Even though Carnegie was getting richer and richer every single second, but he still wouldn't care about his employees. And this is when these employees had enough and they went on strike. But it's not like Andrew Carnegie gave a crap about them. He didn't even care, because the year is 1892 and the only factory that's hiring is Carnegie Steel. It's not like a place where there's a whole lot of steel factories you could just quit and get another job. No. Getting a job at any place was extremely difficult, which is why Carnegie could do this to his employees and still get away from it. He would treat his employees so poorly that 9% of them would die each year. And this was an insane number, even in the 1890s. While this was happening, Andrew Carnegie would interview with newspapers and talk about how workers need better pay and they need to be treated better. But this is exactly why some people would call him a hypocrite on how he treats his workers and how he speaks to the news. Time passes and Andrew Carnegie is 70 years old. He has been working for 60 years now, and he hadn't had a day off, which is why he decides he wants to spend the rest of his life with his family. In a way, he told the world that his company, Carnegie Steel, is up for grabs if anyone is interested. One of the people that was very interested was a man named J.P. Morgan. J.P. Morgan decided to write a letter for Andrew Carnegie on how much he's interested in for his entire company, and he has a man named Charles Schwab deliver the letter. When Andrew Carnegie gets the letter, he writes $480 million and returns it to JP Morgan. When Charles Schwab hands JP Morgan the letter and Morgan sees $480 million, he immediately says yes. When JP Morgan bought Carnegie Steel, he changed the name to US Steel, which remains to this day and is one of the biggest steel manufacturers in America. Even though Andrew Carnegie treated his employees extremely poorly, but he's remembered as one of the men who built America, and he's very well respected for that. He didn't know that he had to treat his employees better if he wants his empire to grow, which is why he eventually sold the entire company to JP Morgan. When you look at someone like Henry Ford, he was the complete opposite. He would treat his employees extremely well. He was the very first person to introduce an 8-hour workday, and he also introduced 2 days off at the end of the week. Because beforehand, you would have to work 10 days every day, and there was no days off in the week. You would work every day until maybe a holiday would show up. Henry Ford, Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, and John D. Rockefeller are known as men who built America. And the only one that's left on this list is JP Morgan, and we'll make that video very soon.